Today we are going to talk about a controversial law in Canada called the Bill C-18. And no, this is not the Bill C-11, which a very popular Canadian YouTuber has said would bring about the end of Canadian content creators on YouTube. Bill C-18 is a different bill that affects how Canadian news is spread across social media. Canada wants to force tech companies to pay Canadian news agencies if they post news or links to Canadian news on social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, or Google Search. Bill C-18 was supposed to force Meta and Google to share their revenues through deals with Canadian publishers like Postmedia. The reasoning for Bill C-18 was Canada's news industry was in shambles. The journalism industry is shrinking. The Canadian government had to step in to save them. The tech companies have taken advertising dollars from Canadian news companies by posting Canadian news for free on their platform for years. So the logic was to make the tech titans pay their fair share to the Canadian news industry. Bill C-18 was inspired by a new Australian law called the News Media Bargaining Code, which was done to force tech giants to pay for Australian news. Initially, both Google and Facebook put out a fight, blocking news on their platforms respectively. However, in the end, both of them backed down. They didn't leave Australia's news industry and made deals with news organizations to pay for the content displayed on their websites. The tech giants had lost and Australia had won. Canada saw this and decided they wanted some of that sweet ad revenue as well. And so, Bill C-18 was introduced to siphon some of the tech giants' ad revenue into Canadian news companies. Not everyone agrees that this is the best way to help the Canadian news companies. Canada's push to save journalism may end up crushing it instead. Google and Meta don't like Bill C-18 at all. Google called Bill C-18 a link tax. Google said the bill created uncertainty for their products and exposed them to uncapped financial liability. Meta said Canadian news companies already benefit from over $200 million worth of remarketing through links placed on Facebook. Google put out a tweet telling everyone they made the difficult decision to remove Canadian news links from their search when Bill C-18 takes effect. Facebook parroted Google's decision, with their President of Global Affairs, Nick Clegg, responding to Bill C-18 through Meta's newsroom. Nick said asking a social media company in 2023 to subsidize news publishers for content that isn't important for our users is similar to the post office asking email providers to pay the postal service because people don't send letters anymore. Facebook has conducted tests by restricting some Canadians' access to Canadian news. Around 5% of Canada's 24 million Facebook users were stopped from accessing news content on Instagram and Facebook. Google tested removing Canadian news of Google Search earlier in the year just to see how internet users would react.
Things that still generate an awful lot of traffic for news organizations across the country, and that's going to disappear. What will be even worse if Google goes forward, because while Facebook is big, Google is multiple times larger than Facebook when it comes to generating traffic.
Bill C-18's scope was broad. While they did not target Google or any other internet company specifically, at least on the surface, in reality, Bill C-18 was actually created to target Google and Facebook specifically. As evidence, while answering a question, Canadian Heritage Minister Rodriguez suggested that only Facebook and Google would be affected by Bill C-18 and that Bing and TikTok and the rest of social media were still way far away from having to pay Canadian news agencies. Now, you might wonder if Google and Meta were being a little too drastic when they stopped people from accessing Canadian news through their platforms. The thing is, that was one of the only ways to avoid Canada's Bill C-18. The law introduced by Bill C-18 applied to companies that made news publicly available and had a significant bargaining power imbalance with Canada's news businesses. That means if Google and Meta stopped making news available to Canadians, then the bill would no longer apply. Canada's government isn't taking all of this standing down. In response to the pushback from the tech companies, the Canadian government are threatening and have already pulled their advertising from Google and Facebook.
Facebook has decided to be unreasonable, irresponsible, and started blocking news. This is why, today, we are announcing the Government of Canada will be suspending advertising on Facebook and Instagram.
They warned this would continue if Canadian news gets blocked on social media and other platforms. Canada's Heritage Minister Rodriguez said the government has other options to fix the situation. without saying what those options were. He also warned tech companies would suffer from the reputational impacts following the block. The President of Canada, Justin Trudeau, said it was horrible that the tech companies would rather cut off Canadians' access to local news instead of paying their fair share to Canadian news outlets. He also said the bullying tactics wouldn't work. News publishers in Canada that the Bill C-18 was supposed to help are warning the government that if Google and Meta make good on their promises to ban Canadian news from their platforms, then millions of dollars of revenue would be lost. Canadian news publishers get a lot of their traffic from Google and Facebook. Many smaller Canadian news outlets would have to shut down. No one would be able to start new news companies in Canada. Business would be over. So what now? Well, Canada could take advice from its former vice chair of CRTC, which regulates broadcast and telecommunications, Peter Menzies, who suggested scrapping the Online News Act, basically Bill C-18, and starting a new fund modeled after the Canadian Media Fund, which Google has said it would support. So what happens now? Maybe Google and Meta might cave into pressure. It doesn't seem likely, but there is a precedent. Facebook and Google have already signed a deal with a Canadian news company, the Globe and Mail, for the right to use their news articles, and they also compromised in Australia. The problem is, what happens in one country or jurisdiction will be seen by others as something that can be replicated in their own country. Google and Facebook already gave in back in Australia. This directly resulted in Canada's Bill C-18. If the tech companies show weakness now, other countries will think it is okay to force the social media giants to pay for their dying news outlets. Setting a precedent like that would drain Google and Meta's profits. Meta and Google want Canada's government to stop its unworkable legislation and instead create a new viable path forward. However, it doesn't seem Trudeau's government will compromise given the drought in ad revenue for Canadian publishers over the last 20 years. To see what actually happens, we will need to wait until Canada's Online News Act comes into effect a few months into the future. I hope you liked the video, leave a like if you did, and subscribe if you haven't already. It's much appreciated.